Good evening, and good morning to everyone. I'd like to welcome all to our fourth edition of the Symposium on Husserlian Phenomenology. This symposium was conceived by Flávio Curvello so as to promote research and debate on topics concerning the interpretation of Husserl's phenomenology. It is being held in conjunction with the Symposium on Mind, Cognition, and Phenomenology, which aims at fostering the debate on the philosophy of mind, especially related to the phenomenological tradition. Previous editions of both events received contributions by Alice Serra, Stephen Gouveia, Joseph Ledoux, Lilian Alves, Giovanni Rolla, André Abate, Sheila Tomé, Célia Cabrera, among others. So far, the editions have been online, but we hope we'll make this an in-person event in Brazil so as to welcome researchers from all over the world who are interested in these topics. In tonight's session, we'll have a presentation by Saulius Geniusas. And before introducing him, let me just have a short word in Brazilian Portuguese for our native speakers. Boas-vindas a todas e todos. Estamos abrindo aqui o Simpósio de Fenomenologia Husserliana. Esse é a quarta edição desse simpósio, que está sendo, mais uma vez, realizado em conjunto, em articulação com o Simpósio Mente, Cognição e Fenomenologia. Trata-se desse simpósio de Fenomenologia Husserliana, da discussão, do debate, da pesquisa em torno da exegese do trabalho de Husserl. Sem mais delongas, a gente está fazendo essa sessão em inglês, estamos recebendo aqui Saulius Geniusas. Eu volto agora para o inglês, so switching back to English. I'd like to introduce Saulius Geniusas. Saulius Geniusas is professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His main philosophical interests lie in 19th, 20th, and 21st century continental philosophy, especially in phenomenology and hermeneutics. Over the last few years, he has aimed to advance phenomenology into areas that still remain unexplored. Most of his recent publications have been focused on issues relating to affectivity, especially for such phenomena as pain, imagination, especially productive imagination, self-awareness, especially displaced self-awareness, and historicity, especially sedimentation. Methodologically, his research is grounded in the principles of classical phenomenology. He has published widely in the field. He is the recipient of the 2020-2021 Research Excellence Award at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. His book, The Phenomenology of Pain, appearing in the Ohio University Press in 2020, was selected as the winner of 2 awards: the Edward Ballard Prize, awarded by the Center for Advanced Research in Phenomenology for an outstanding book in phenomenology, and of the Hermes Award, a book of the year in phenomenological hermeneutics, awarded by the International Institute for Hermeneutics. His publications also include Phenomenology of Productive Imagination, Embodiment, Language, Subjectivity, Varieties of Self-Awareness, The Unconscious in Husserl's Phenomenology, and many others. Today, Professor Geniusas will be presenting a talk entitled Metaphysics as Transformed Phenomenology, Husserl's project of transcendental teleology. Professor Geniusas, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It is an honor to have you here, and the proverbial floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this kind introduction, and thank you also to all the organizers for the invitation. It's certainly a pleasure and an honor as well for me to be here today. I'm on the other side of the world in Hong Kong right now, but it's nice that we still have a possibility to meet this morning or this evening, depending on where we are. So my lecture will be around 45-50 minutes long, and afterwards we'll turn to a discussion. There is a handout in the chat function. So if you go to chat, you can see the handout. Please download it. It will be easier for you to follow my lecture. The line of thought is indicated there. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I have a handout. Okay, then like to begin, and I would like to begin with some thoughts on Husserl's phenomenological metaphysics. So what's the relation between Husserlian phenomenology and metaphysics? Well, there are different views. One popular view in phenomenology suggests that when it comes to this relation, East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet. That is, phenomenology is metaphysically neutral. That's one popular view. According to another popular view, there is no border between East and West. Phenomenology is metaphysics of presence. So the first view capitalizes on Husserl's critique of traditional metaphysics, but it ignores Husserl's own attempt to develop a phenomenologically grounded metaphysics. When it comes to the second view, it imposes an alien conception of metaphysics on Husserl's thought. So in the present context, in today's lecture, I don't want to provide an account of the origins and development of Husserl's conception of metaphysics. This would be too large of a topic. I will be concerned with how Husserl himself understands phenomenological metaphysics in the manuscripts that were collected in the 42nd volume of Husserliana, the only volume that is dedicated to phenomenological metaphysics. So as the editors of this volume, Rochus Sova and Thomas Fonger, have shown, Husserl used the concept of metaphysics while addressing three interrelated sets of issues, namely monadology, theology, and teleology. So when Husserl himself speaks of metaphysics, these are the three things that he has in mind. All three are closely intertwined, and therefore it is not possible to address any of them without, at the same time, touching on all. But in what follows, I will be mainly concerned with Husserl's teleology, and I will leave his reflections on monadology and theology out of consideration, to the best of my capacity. Husserl's own metaphysical reflections on monadology, teleology, and theology have not been addressed as carefully as other themes in phenomenology, and for more than one reason. So first, only recently has the relevant literature become accessible to the scholarly community in printed form. Another reason is that, still today, to many well-established figures in the field, anything like Husserlian metaphysics sounds like wood and iron. Even if one concedes that metaphysical neutrality cannot be attributed to phenomenology, so Zahavi holds such a view, still, to speak of implications regarding the realism-idealism debate, as he does, is one thing, while to speak of monads, teleology, and theology is, of course, an entirely different matter. As Henning Poyka once remarked, when reading Husserl's manuscripts on the world's teleological structure or of the necessary faith in God, I quote him, "An experienced reader of Husserl's philosophical texts," he says, "will not immediately believe his own eyes," unquote. And I'll admit that was very much my own experience when I started reading these manuscripts. We are at the threshold of a dangerous territory which many are unwilling to enter, and understandably so, for doing so carries the risk of demoting phenomenology's reputation as a respectable philosophical method and tradition. We come across Husserl's reflections on metaphysical teleology already in 1908, and Husserl continued to return to this theme until 1930s. Some of these reflections are to be found in private correspondence and in research manuscripts. Other reflections are also scattered throughout his published texts, where Husserl draws a distinction between different kinds of metaphysics, thereby leaving the possibility open for something like a phenomenologically grounded metaphysics. So especially in the Cartesian Meditations, we come across such references. So here, I would like to address Husserlian teleology with some hermeneutical generosity, although without making any commitment regarding its phenomenological legitimacy. Even if one holds the view that Husserl's metaphysical claims go beyond phenomenology, and I do not want to discard such a possibility. Still, here we come across Husserl's deepest commitments presented in a highly direct way. So irrespective of what one thinks of the relation between phenomenology and metaphysics, acquainting ourselves with these views can provide us with a deeper understanding of the fundamental aspirations of his phenomenology. Okay, Kant drew a distinction between dogmatic and critical teleology, arguing that while the dogmatic teleology affirms the reality of purposefulness in nature, critical teleology assigns teleology only a heuristic or regulative function, and he meant thereby that we necessarily conceptualize nature in teleological terms. In Husserl, we come across an analogous distinction between pre-phenomenological teleology and the teleology that is grounded in the principles of phenomenological methodology, a distinction that goes along with a more general distinction between pre-phenomenological or non-phenomenological metaphysics and phenomenologically founded metaphysics. So much like Kant's dogmatic teleology, Husserl's pre-phenomenological teleology makes determinative claims about the teleological structure of the natural world. By contrast, and in line with Kant's critical teleology, phenomenologically grounded teleology is concerned with conditions of possibility of experiencing the world and not with the world as such. Husserl's most detailed account of pre-phenomenological teleology is to be found in his lectures, Introduction to Philosophy, that he delivered at the University of Freiburg already in 1916 to 1920. So this was published in Materialen 9. While in part 2 of the Crisis, Husserl famously presented the history of modern philosophy as a battle between two tendencies, namely physicalistic objectivism and transcendental subjectivism. In these lectures that I'm referring to, he spoke of a different conflict in pre-modern philosophy, namely the conflict between the teleological and the naturalistic worldviews, that is, between teleological metaphysics and naturalism. Husserl was always committed to the view that the naturalistic explanation of the world leaves too many questions unanswered. Not surprisingly, in these lectures, he found the metaphysical opposition to naturalism understandable and praiseworthy. The naturalistic explanation leaves one hungry. It does not respond to the fundamental needs of reason. It leaves too many questions unanswered, questions that are ultimate and highest. But in these lectures, Husserl also argued that the metaphysical alternative is full of flaws. Teleological explanation required that one clarified the world's efficient and final causes, which was usually done while sneaking in divine intelligence. Metaphysics repeatedly endeavored new and often grandiose attempts to carry out a satisfying explanation of the world while relying on the naive, that is, natural and pre-critical view of the world's being in itself. So here I quote Husserl. He says, "We have countless systems of teleological metaphysics, and in many of them a serious, even a passionate scientific will is expressed, but metaphysics never succeeded in acquiring secure foundations," he says, efficient methods, or firm results. It remains, he says, an unfulfilled postulate to this day. Against the background of this battle between naturalism and teleological metaphysics, Husserl saw the emergence of transcendentalism to be a secularized version of metaphysics. Moreover, in Husserl's judgment, the promised fulfillment of transcendentalism in phenomenology was meant to give it what it otherwise lacked, namely a firm methodological foundation that enables it to reach secure results. But as the manuscripts collected in the 42nd volume of Husserliana further demonstrate, Husserl at the same time recognized that transcendental phenomenology, as it was presented in his published works, also leaves one hungry in that it does not address the ultimate and highest questions. He was committed to the view that ultimately, as he puts it in a text from 1934, transcendental phenomenology must pave the way to what he calls metaphysics as transformed phenomenology. That's a quote. Metaphysics as transformed phenomenology is a concept that we come across in Husserl's own writings. Okay, so what is Husserl's teleology then all about? Well, first of all, it is not a teleology of nature. Phenomenology brackets all claims regarding the natural world, including the claims regarding its alleged teleology. The question whether the functional organization of nature requires a teleological explanation or not is just not Husserl's question. Husserl does not have a stake in this debate for the simple reason that such a question cannot be answered phenomenologically. Just as Husserlian teleology is not a teleology of nature, so also it is not a teleology of the world in itself. Husserl makes this clear. I quote him, "We do not seek for things behind things," unquote. That is, phenomenology is not concerned with nature as it is in itself. The fatal flaw of pre-phenomenological teleologies is that they are pre-transcendental. Whether one sees teleology as inherent to nature or as issuing from divine intelligence, one addresses teleology in abstraction from the constituting consciousness. If it is possible to speak of a phenomenological teleology, then it must be grounded in phenomenological principles, which means it must be first and foremost concerned with intentional and world constituting consciousness and not with nature as such or the world in itself. So Husserl qualifies phenomenological teleology as transcendental. What does this mean? Well, we can take this to mean that Husserl's teleology is enlightened by the methods of the epoché and the reduction. Can we find within the reduced experience motivations to speak of a teleology, understood both as a teleology of consciousness and a teleology of the experienced world? What would these motivations be? How strong can they be? These are the questions to which Husserlian teleology is meant to provide an answer. Does this mean that we are faced here with a teleology of reduced consciousness? But what are we to understand under this heading of reduced consciousness? This is, in fact, a tricky question. Recall that in the famous paragraph 49 of Ideas 1, Husserl entertained the possibility of the reduced consciousness surviving the annihilation of the world. If the flow of experiences became so chaotic that no intentions would lead to fulfillment, then the reduced consciousness would no longer have any reasonable motivations to think that the world exists. The life of such consciousness, which would unfold in constant chaos, could not be qualified as teleological. The same is to be said about the reduced consciousness which finds itself in dreamless sleep, which in Husserl's late writings is on occasion understood as a prototype of death. So we can safely say that, at least in some of its modes, the reduced consciousness is not teleological. So under what conditions, then, can we think of the reduced consciousness as teleological? To characterize the reduced consciousness as teleological is to contend that it constitutes the world, and it does so in a teleological fashion. By implication, this also means that the world is teleological insofar as it is constituted by a teleologically structured transcendental consciousness. Husserl's teleology is neither a teleology of nature nor of the world in itself, but a teleology of the transcendental world constituting subjectivity and, correlatively, a teleology of the experienced, that is, constituted world. Teleology concerns the harmonious interrelation between different layers of world constitution. Yet it is not enough to think of the reduced consciousness as world constituting to qualify it as teleological. Husserl himself admits that if we consider each consciousness in separation from other consciousnesses, then we will never come to see its teleological nature. So the same objection that was raised above against the view that teleology is inscribed in intentionality can be also reiterated against the view that the world constituting consciousness is teleological. On one occasion, Husserl writes, I quote him, "I cannot demand from my individual life that it be blissful, that it have an ideal form," unquote. My own individual life need not be structured teleologically for the world of experience to be teleological. But Husserl seems to think that the situation changes entirely when one takes on a more holistic point of view. Husserl's teleology is not just a teleology of reduced consciousness, but rather a teleology of reduced consciousnesses, considered not just in terms of plurality, but more precisely in terms of generativity. Husserl considers teleology to be an intersubjective and a generative phenomenon. So, in a manuscript still from 1908, which was published as text number 11 in the 42nd volume of Husserliana, Husserl distinguishes between two levels in phenomenological analysis. The first level consists of a return to what he here identifies as the first absolute, that is, the reduced consciousness, while the second level consists of the unity of the manifold of monads through their teleology, their harmony. These are the terms that he himself employs. Husserl's teleology concerns the generative relation between monads in the world that they themselves constitute and that they themselves inhabit. It thereby becomes understandable why Husserl would speak of the teleology of the experienced world by linking it to the plurality of monads that constitute it. The teleological world is characterized by the harmonious interrelation between monads, which Husserl further qualifies as a growing or enhancing harmony, steigernde Harmonie, to use his expression. By this he means that the world is such that in it the highest values realize themselves as they develop in levels. But what could possibly support the view that the generative relation between monads is teleological? Wars, natural disasters, premature death, the breakdown of values, etc. Too much evidence speaks against such a view. One would be right to observe that even more evidence spoke against such a view at the time when Husserl was composing the manuscripts in question. Now, some of these manuscripts were written in the aftermath of World War I, others after 1933 in Germany. Husserl is well aware of all the irrationality around him, and in the manuscripts collected in this volume, he often discusses what he calls the thousandfold irrationality. Husserl's metaphysical theology must be understood against such a background. So as James Hart puts it, I quote Hart here, he says, "The threat of ultimate meaninglessness due to life's real irrationalities shadows all radical reflection in Husserl. Husserl's reflections on teleology are concerned with this very threat." Now, another aspect. Husserl's teleology is grounded in belief. I do not and I cannot know that the world is teleological, yet I can believe that it is. One of Husserl's central goals in this manuscripts on metaphysical teleology is to demonstrate that this belief is not arbitrary. Belief in the teleological structure of the experienced world has its own evidence, he wants to argue. So in a manuscript written in 1924, Husserl writes, I quote him, "What must be believed so that the world can have meaning after all, so that human life in it can remain rational? The content of belief is never justifiable through theoretical cognition, but belief is justifiable through the motive of a possible practical rational life." Much of what I will now have to say will be a commentary and interpretation of what Husserl is saying here. So, what sense are we to make of such a practical justification? In Text number 14, also written in 1924, Husserl contends that theoretical reason is grounded in practical reason. Here he argues that the ratio of theoretical reason, of universal experience, and of experiential thinking is an imperfect ratio, for it is supported only by the unanimity of past experience and the anticipation that nothing will speak against it in the future. And of course, anticipations can break down. The anticipation of which Husserl, following Hume, speaks here is itself qualified as a rational belief in the rational structure of the world. And this, Husserl claims, is the evidence that gives rise to empirical certainty. Husserl's further reflections in Appendix 23, written a year later in 1925, are of great importance. In this manuscript, Husserl returns to the infamous thought experiment that I already mentioned regarding the annihilation of the world. So, paragraph 49 in Ideas 1. So in this earlier text from 1913 from Ideas 1, Husserl had argued that the hypothetical annihilation of the world would not lead to the annihilation of transcendental consciousness, from which he concluded that the being of transcendental consciousness is absolute, while the being of the world is relative. In the text from 1925, Husserl returns to this thought experiment, yet with the ambition to show that, I quote, the world must exist and it must be teleological, unquote. However, the necessity of which he speaks here is practical, not theoretical. So how to understand that? In this manuscript, after reiterating the earlier claims that the world can possibly be destroyed, this is conceivable, Husserl further adds that the world's annihilation is possible, I quote him, only if we take it as pure theory. However, I quote him further, I am not merely an objectively judging ego, the ego that establishes facts and the essential laws of facts, unquote. Emphasizing each word, Husserl writes, the emotions, Gemüt, and the will are the source of what is right and just, and judgment only comes to grasp and state it, unquote. Needless to say, just because one desires something does not provide one with emotional evidence. Yet in Husserl's reflections, once the ego comes concretely into consideration in its full life, that is, once the possibility of fulfilling itself purely as an ego is called into question, one is confronted with the evidence of emotions, Gemütsevidenz. Husserl writes, and that quote is also on your handout, he says that, what is that? An unbearable thought? I can imagine that there would be no world while I experience it. Can the world be a mere semblance of possibilities of reasonable life? In Husserl's judgment, this would go against the evidence of emotions. I continue to quote Husserl. He says, I cannot believe it. I can only believe what makes it possible for me to be a rational self. The belief that the world exists already rests on the belief in the world. It is a practical necessity, he says. In order for me to be an ego of acts at all, and to be able to sustain truth in any form, and thus to be something identical and progressively active, there must be a world, and the world must be teleological. So, according to Husserl, the thesis of the world's existence is indeed grounded in belief, as he had argued in section 49 in Ideas 1. There he also spoke of belief as the ground for our access to the world. But this belief, he now adds, is practically necessary. The existence of the world and its teleological structure are grounded in a belief which itself has its own evidence, which Husserl qualifies as the evidence of emotions, Gemütsevidenz. Insofar as this belief is rooted in practical reason, it cannot be qualified as a religious belief. On occasion, so as to distinguish religious beliefs and rational belief, Husserl draws a distinction between the concept of belief, used in English, and pure doxa, used in Greek. Husserl further qualifies the belief in the world's teleological nature both as a rational belief and as a belief in reason. So he further draws such a distinction. This belief is rational. In which sense? Well, in the sense that it is grounded in practical reason. It is a belief in reason, for it strives to realize axiological values. While understanding reason in the broad sense that Husserl has given this term, namely as the theoretical, axiological, and practical reason, we can further qualify Husserl's metaphysical teleology as a teleology of reason. Well, the question of metaphysical teleology begins after the performance of the epoché and the reduction, also after one transitions from the standpoint of theoretical reason to that of practical and axiological reason. But this is not an abandonment of rationalism. Quite on the contrary, I would say we are faced here with rationalism on steroids. To the question, what conditions must be met for a rational form of life to be possible, Husserl's answer reads, life must be teleological. For practical reasons, the intermonadic generational community needs the world for reasons that concern its own rational development. In the absence of the world, it could not reach its own rational goals, nor could it lead a full-fledged, meaningful existence. Husserl considers teleology to be a necessary idea from the standpoint of practical reason, by which he means that it is necessary for a meaningful and rational development of the life of intermonadic community. So Timo Mietonen, in one of his essays on Husserlian teleology, writes, he says, the concept of teleology does not imply any kind of determinism, but rather takes the function of a working hypothesis, unquote. And this seems to me to be right. Without a belief in such an idea, a meaningful and rational existence would still be possible, although only within limits. Sooner or later, the rational and meaningful framework of human existence would break down. In effect, this would mean that the phenomenological ambition to give an account of the constitution of a meaningful world could not be carried through. It would remain a presumptive thought experiment, always on the brink of collapse, until finally it would collapse. So here we see the function that teleology performs in Husserl's Phenomenology. What is the telos of this teleology? In text number 19 in Husserliana 42, Husserl describes it in a highly Platonic way, namely as the unity of ideas, which is the highest and the ultimate given in evidence, which implies and also relativizes all other evidences, which is an ideal and which has an over-reality, over-truth, over-actuality. These are Husserl's terms. And this telos gives meaning to all relative, finite, worldly, and even transcendental monadic being in general. So we see thereby how Husserlian teleology, in the radical and universal gesture, redeems the insight inscribed in Plato's idea of the good. Husserl leaves us with no doubt that the telos inscribed in his teleology lies in the indefinite future. As he puts it in text number 16, the teleologically ideal world lies entirely in the unreachable future. It is indefinitely removed from us. As Husserl remarks while discussing the realization of axiological ideas, he says, I can only become good, but not be good. To return to Kant's distinction between dogmatic and critical teleology, we can once again state that the telos that guides over Husserlian teleology functions as a regulative idea meant to rule over a human being's practical life. So to summarize then, here are the crucial elements that make up Husserl's metaphysical teleology, and that's also in the handout. Husserl's metaphysical teleology is neither a teleology of nature nor a teleology of the world in itself. It is a transcendental teleology whose possibility is grounded in the methods of the epoché and the reduction, It is a teleology of the reduced consciousnesses considered in a generative framework. It is a teleology of reason, which counteracts all irrationality and all meaninglessness, a teleology of reason understood in the broad sense that encompasses theoretical, practical, and axiological reason. It is a teleology that is grounded in a rational belief, doxa, that is justified not by theoretical but by practical reason, a teleology whose telos always lies in the future and which therefore functions as a regulative idea. So that's Husserl's teleology. Now, the next question that I want to turn to, having now presented the idea of this teleology, is what function does this teleology serve in Husserl's phenomenology? There is more than one answer to this question regarding function. So let me begin with the answer that I consider to be most fundamental. While Husserl understood phenomenology to be a radical and a universal science, in his deepening reflections, he came to realize that phenomenology cannot reach its fundamental goals if it ignores the central issues that have been addressed in metaphysics in general and teleology in particular. Without incorporating reflections on teleology, phenomenology could not be either radical or universal. One can therefore say that Husserl needs teleology not so as to clip the wings of science, but so as to make it truly radical and universal. For this reason, Husserl's reflections on teleology are scattered throughout various manuscripts. They are concerned with the ultimate ambitions of his phenomenology. Instead of viewing phenomenological teleology with suspicion and contempt, the phenomenological community should recognize that a critical examination of metaphysical concepts is necessary by virtue of the very essence of phenomenological philosophy. Husserl needs teleology so as to resolve various impasses and contradictions that his phenomenological reflections generate. What kind of impasses? What kind of contradictions? First, Husserl needs teleology so as to make rational life possible. In the face of the thousandfold irrationality, Husserl's rationalism comes into question. Nothing can bolster it more than teleology, which transforms all irrationality into a developmental moment within a more embracive rationality. In this regard, we can speak of teleology's logical function. Now, besides that, and that's now I move to the second point, Husserl also needs teleology so as to render the world of experience intrinsically meaningful. Husserl writes, I quote him, he says, "The world has meaning, Sinn, which means personal life in the world and in relation to it has a unity of sense, Einsinnigkeit. It has harmony, unity of purpose in absolute purposes, harmony between all personal absolute purposes, harmony between all possible duties, without which the ego cannot live," he says, "and the community cannot live, namely, insofar as it could not be blissful, could not live in such a way that it could be satisfied with itself, following its absolute must." Well, this also explains why, for Husserl, reflections on teleology are closely tied to self-preservation, a theme to which he refers on various occasions. So in this regard, alongside teleology's logical function, we can also speak of its existential function. Belief in teleology is what makes life under all circumstances livable. So recall the important objection mentioned above. How could Husserl commit himself to a teleological worldview precisely at a time when so much evidence spoke against it? Well, in response, one could say he did so precisely because so much evidence spoke against it. So that's the existential function. Now, third, besides the logical and existential function, we can also speak of teleology's ethical function. In his Phenomenology of Love, Husserl considered what happens when a conflict arises between two absent values, the love of one's child and the love of one's nation, to use Husserl's favorite example. According to Husserl, ethical conflicts of this nature cannot be resolved under the law of absorption, which states that lower values should be absorbed under higher values. So also conflicts of this nature cannot be resolved under the law of summation, which states that the sum of goods is itself a good. But in the present case, neither value can be rationally preferred over another one, and therefore Husserl speaks of sacrifice. Whatever one chooses, one will have to sacrifice another absolute value. But it can also happen so that one chooses one absolute value over another, yet in one's choice, one ends up losing both absolute values. So in text number 14 in Husserliana 42, Husserl considers what happens when absolute values can no longer sustain one's life. So the mother wants to raise her beloved child, but the child dies. This leads the mother to proclaim, "My life was in vain." That is Husserl. And Husserl continues, "My fatherland, even if it is not entirely blameless," and he adds, "but who is absolutely blameless, is trampled to the ground and buried in a flood of hatred, contempt, and slander. Could it not be that the lives of all of us and all of humanity are subject to the stigma of this nothingness?" Husserl's answer points in the direction of teleology. Husserl needs teleology so as to overcome the limitations of love, for as the manuscript in question demonstrates, love alone cannot be victorious against all senselessness. Moreover, what if a conflict arises between my absolute values and the absolute values of the other, both of which presumably are rooted in love? Husserl himself remarks that such a scenario is not just imaginary, but happens quite regularly in the case of war. So, in the same text, Husserl writes, "Of course, there is a paradox here. In fact, conscience often demands the opposite one the other, as in war. And yet it cannot be the case that the rational purpose of the one, following the absolute call, cancels out that of the other." So according to Husserl's own admission then, ethics of love leads us to a contradiction, and one of the worst imaginable. According to Husserl, the solution to this contradiction lies in teleology. I quote him, "If all real values, including subjectively rooted individual values, form an infinite relativism, then there can only be an absolute value if the whole world, with all personalities and all factually constituted surrounding worlds of experience and cognition, forms a self-contained teleological system in which every ego, every absolute ought itself has its teleological place," unquote. Presumably, the relativism of absolute values is overcome in a self-contained teleological system, which we can take to mean that Husserl's own ambition was to ground his ethics of love in a philosophical teleology, and thereby overcome the impasses and contradictions that it generates. And what about conflicts or tensions between different cultural worlds? On occasion, Husserl remarks that all cultures have access to truth, but this can be demonstrated only teleologically, that is, only insofar as they all are seen as parts within a self-contained teleological system. So Husserl's phenomenological teleology is first and foremost concerned with various paradoxes and impasses that his phenomenological reflections have generated. And here we can recall Husserl's reference to fragment 45 from Heraclitus. "You will never find the boundaries of the soul, even if you follow every road. So deep is its ground." Husserl further adds, "Indeed, every ground that is reached points to further grounds. Every horizon opened up awakens new horizons," unquote. This provides further confirmation that a teleology of which Husserl speaks and which is supposed to resolve the paradoxes and impasses which phenomenological reflection generates intends ideal meanings which lie in the indefinite future. Husserlian teleology is not designed to justify the present as the culminating point of history, or to interpret all past errors as the cunning of reason that has led to history's fulfillment in the present. Quite on the contrary, it is designed to make us conscious of the crises of the present and to awaken us to philosophy's infinite task to search for their resolutions. I turned to another question, namely, to what degree are Husserl's reflections on teleology phenomenological? That is the third and final question that I wish to address. So Gadamer once remarked that in his teaching, whenever he encountered grand assertions, rash combinations, and clever constructions on the part of his students, Husserl used to say, not always the big bills, small change, small change. And this, Gadamer says, produced a peculiar fascination. It had the effect of a purgation, a return to honesty, a liberation from the opaqueness of the opinions, slogans, and battle cries that circulated. But now and again, small change was not enough, not even for Husserl. When it comes to Husserl's reflections on teleology, we see Husserl take out the big bills. This brings up the methodological question whether he has phenomenological reasons and phenomenological right to do so. We therefore need to ask, to what degree can such a metaphysical teleology be justified phenomenologically? Husserl makes clear that his ambition is to ground teleology in phenomenology. He explicitly speaks of metaphysics as transformed phenomenology. He contends that a phenomenologically grounded metaphysics transcends the historical facticity of all regions and that it at the same time provides the basis for a critique of the naturalistic worldview and of science insofar as it is understood as mere technique. But has Husserl succeeded in laying the ground for such a phenomenologically grounded metaphysics? Well, this issue has been addressed in the literature, and here I want to draw some references, to draw your attention to some of the ways in which it has been addressed. So first, here is Klaus Held speaking about this issue. The quote is on the handout. Klaus Held writes, he says, through the idealization that prevails everywhere, modern humanity, according to Husserl's well-known formulation in The Crisis, weaves a garb of ideas that covers over, conceals, and pushes into oblivion the solidly based and evidence-saturated life world. But, Held continues, Husserl himself is still under the spell of this oblivion as long as he considers that the telos of the history of religion is a belief in reason resulting from idealization in which God plays the role of the ideal pole. Husserl's critique of the forgetfulness of the life world thus calls for a meta-critique, claims Held, namely a critique that applies to his own phenomenology of religion, unquote. Now, besides Held, consider also what Henning Poyker has to say about this issue. He says, I quote Poyker, he says, Husserl's latest ethics is intertwined with extensive metaphysical and theological reflections that are not always based on careful phenomenological foundations. He continues, Husserl tried to combine his theological ideas with a teleological worldview, but even here is he aware of the systematic problems that arise in connections with questions for a justification of that alleged teleology. And then I want to draw your attention to a third author, namely John Drummond, who presents a very similar view. He says, I quote him, Husserl's claim that human agency is the working out of the divine entelechy through human agency requires a phenomenology of absolute consciousness that is problematic, and its religious dimension traverses the bounds of his own presuppositionless phenomenology. Well, what can be said on Husserl's behalf in light of these three critiques? I think a fourfold response is in place. So first, these critiques either ignore or do not pay sufficient attention to the distinction that Husserl has drawn between religious belief and rational doxa that I was referring to. This distinction, which Husserl draws explicitly, makes clear that Husserl himself was aware that his reflections on teleology and theology might give rise to the wrong impression, the very one that the critics have attributed to Husserl, namely, that these reflections are motivated by his own personal religious views. Drawing a distinction between belief that is based in revelation and belief that is motivated in experience, Husserl argued that his teleology is grounded in a rational and not in a religious belief. This brings into question the attempt on the part of the critics to brush teleological considerations aside on the alleged basis that they derive from Husserl's own religious beliefs. So this critique, to my mind, is questionable. Now, second, Husserl's teleological reflections are motivated not by his religious views, but rather by his attempt to resolve various impasses and contradictions that his phenological reflections have generated. For these reasons, and this is the real problem, while they cannot be easily incorporated into phenomenology, teleological considerations also cannot be easily dismissed. For the question remains, are there better ways to deal with the logical, existential, and ethical impasses that phenomenology generates, and that Husserl's phenomenological teleology was meant to resolve? So if one concludes that Husserlian rationalism cannot be justified teleologically, well, what other modes of justification can it be provided with? And the same concerns the ethical and existential issues mentioned earlier. So also in his post-World War I writings, Husserl repeatedly raised the existential question that concerns the possibility of meaning of human existence in a meaningless world. His late Ethics of Love, coupled with teleology and theology, was supposed to provide an answer to this existential predicament. If these answers are dismissed as phenomenologically illegitimate, a further question needs to be raised. What other alternative modes of justification can be offered to this predicament, and are these alternative justifications in any way better than the teleological one? Lastly, Husserl's Ethics of Love leads to various impasses and contradictions, which Husserl was hoping to resolve through teleological considerations. If this resolution is not accepted, what other better solutions can be offered? Okay, now the third point is that the critics contend that Husserl's teleology and theology traverse the bounds of his presuppositionless phenomenology, for God's existence and the teleological structure of the world are posited without sufficient phenomenological justification. But let me stress that phenomenological teleology does not go against the principle of presuppositionless phenomenology. However, what it does is place this principle not at the beginning, but rather at the ideal end of phenomenological reflections. Presuppositionlessness is no longer the starting point, but rather the ideal end point. So in one manuscript, Husserl speaks of science and philosophy as forms of anamnesis, adding that this should not be understood as mere recollection, but as a radical self-understanding. We can take this to mean that the goal of science and philosophy is to clarify their own presuppositions. Being grounded in a rational belief, teleology resists determinism, which allows one to further claim that it becomes a critical instrument of phenomenology. And insofar as it is an infinite telos of philosophy, the latter cannot be conceived merely as a historicist expression of a particular worldview. I turn to brief concluding observations. Despite all the suspicion about phenomenology's relation to metaphysics, one thing is clear. It was never Husserl's intention to exclude metaphysical reflections from his phenomenology. So I think this talk makes this point clear. Rather, offering a bottoms-up approach, Husserl was committed to the view that metaphysical questions should be addressed only after laying the groundwork of phenomenology, only after clarifying what methods are to be employed to address the ultimate and highest questions. And this is where we encounter a difficulty. Even though Husserl aimed to ground his metaphysics phenomenologically, he did not provide a reliable method to carry out his task. Moreover, he also explicitly recognized that there is an important difference between the validity of the claims presented in his published works, such as Ideas 1, and the validity of phenomenological metaphysics, which he had mainly addressed in his unpublished research manuscripts. Understandably, therefore, we come across only scattered remarks on metaphysics in general and teleology in particular in Husserl's published texts. But it is not easy to dismiss Husserl's metaphysical considerations just for this reason alone, for the dismissal opens up numerous problems, which one then needs to find alternative, better ways to resolve. In general, phenomenological teleology constitutes a serious problem for phenomenology, a problem which one cannot ignore, and one turns out to be a different kind of phenomenologist depending on how one decides to deal with it. Should one choose to purify phenomenology of all metaphysics, one will be left with the task of offering an alternative clarification of the problems that Husserl's teleological metaphysics was meant to resolve. Should one consider teleological metaphysics a legitimate phenomenological theme, one would then face the task of developing Husserlian methodology in a way that would enable it to reliably address the ultimate and highest problems. So we can understand phenomenological metaphysics as a task to which Husserl himself was deeply committed, yet which he had left for the future generations of phenomenologists, which, so he was hoping, would continue to carry out the project of his phenomenology, understood as a rigorous science with radical and universal ambitions. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Geniusas.